Hello, it is Friday, May the 1st, and we are ready to talk about some of the events that happened during President Coolidge's term. So, we're talking about the majority of the 20s. So, his term is about 1923, 24 to 29. So, we're covering a lot of the 20s, and we already talked a little bit about what the time was like, that it was just this kind of free, fun time. And so now we're going to cover some of the things that um, happened during those years. Okay, maybe we'll see a little bit about why it was so free and fun, and if he had anything to do with it or not. Okay, so keep cool with Coolidge was his motto for his election, and you see one of the posters there. This woman is representing the United States, and he is steering them to probably prosperity and good times. We've got the card here, and he was vice president one time, so that's part of that card. Okay. Legislation. So here's what he did as far as bills passed and what was going on in the government. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about kind of how he ran things first. His calm, quiet nature was what the country needed, because as Harding died, all of this news of corruption was coming out. I didn't really talk to you a lot about the scandals at the end of Harding's term, but there were several, but one of the biggest scandals was called the Teapot Dome scandal. And what basically what happened was there was this land that was set aside to only be drilling oil in case we had a military emergency. So the land was set aside. No big oil companies were supposed to drill there. But the person in charge of that was taking money from big companies to say, well, if you want to drill, I'll let you, if you give me this much money. And he was allowing them to drill. This area was called Teapot Dome, allowing them to drill there and he was getting personal money because of it. So that came out. That guy is eventually sent to prison at the beginning of Coolidge's term. And all of this is coming out. And can you imagine how just uneasy it makes the American people feel that they can't trust the people that are in leadership? So here comes Coolidge, and he is this very simple northerner, grew up on a farm in Vermont, has this kind of way north in the United States, has a very kind of, the picture of the people is very stern and moralistic. They do the right thing, they try real hard, they work real hard, and that's kind of the New England image that you have. Well, that was Coolidge to a T. And here he was kind of a solid figure that we needed in this term where we felt like we couldn't trust anybody. He represented the old fashioned values and work ethic that contrasted with what we see everyone else doing. Everyone else is living it up and being free and spending money freely, and he was always very thrifty, very frugal. They didn't spend money that they didn't need to spend, and he treated the government the same way. And that's what I think is cool. He was just as frugal with the government as he was in his personal life. So that may allow us to see a little bit about why the 20s were so good, because he was controlling things within the government so that we weren't overspending and kind of getting things back in control after we had done a lot of spending during the war years, so that people could have the freedom to buy and to have jobs and have an income and do well with that, and then be able to have whatever expenses they wanted or needed. One thing I heard, no one knows for sure why he chose not to run for another term. He could have, and all he did was just come out and say, I choose not to run again. One observation that someone said was that possibly, and he even said this, that maybe the country is ready to spend money. And I am not that kind of person. I'm not the kind of person to spend the government's money. I'm the one trying to save it. And I think that's very interesting because he's seen as this kind of president who didn't do very much, and the 20s just kind of rolled along and he was just there. But I don't think that was true. I think the 20s rolled along and were good because he was being watchful, because he was being mindful of how we were spending our money. When he was in office, our national debt reduced from about $23 million to $16 million. So I told you we always have this kind of national debt where we owe money as a country. He actually brought in some money so that that debt reduced. His famous saying was, the business of America is business. And he wanted to make sure that the business companies could do what they needed to do. He felt like it, and a lot of people remember have been against big business, but he felt like if the businesses were doing well, then they would hire more people, then they would put more money back into the economy, and then everything would work well. And it proved to work well. So one of his biggest things was he lowered taxes several different times. And he did that to encourage businesses. Taxes had been raised so high for very wealthy people, and he actually reduced them so that they could be putting money back into the economy, and the economy would go. See, if the business leaders have money, then they can hire more people, and then those people have more money. And then they can spend it into the economy. We need a system that works well. If I don't have a job and I'm not making any money, I'm not spending any money. And then those people aren't making any money. So it's a big circle, and you have to have the knowledge of how it works and to be able to help it run well. He vetoed farm relief bills. There was some farmers were having trouble selling all of their produce, and there was a bill that came across that said, well, we need to just pay them, we need to set a price and pay them that price for their produce, and then we'll sell their produce overseas, but the government won't make any money. We'll probably lose money on this. Well, Coolidge didn't think this was smart that we would lose money as a country by giving money into something that we shouldn't. And so he vetoed those farm bills, and a lot of people blame some of the hard times that the farmers had during the Depression on Coolidge not passing these relief bills. He also vetoed a veteran bonus bill that was saying that the veterans of the war should get extra money. And his reasoning, this was very interesting. He vetoed it, but a quote from him was talking about how he vetoed it because he believed that it lessened the honor that they receive from the country. That as a hero, you do what you do, not because you get paid, but because that was the right thing to do. And he said it would lessen their honor by giving them extra money. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's an interesting idea. He was given a large amount of money to make improvements to the White House. And at first he was like, oh, no way, I'm not using our money to improve the White House. But then the roof almost fell in, literally. Like the roof of the White House was caving in. Remember, this is a very old house, and it was starting to have some physical problems. And so he had to move out for a time, and actually they kind of moved around and ran the White House from different houses during some of their term because of some of the work that was going on in the White House to fix the roof. So he didn't want to spend money on that, but he needed to because it was about to fall in. Okay, this is cool. In 1924, he passed the Indian Citizenship Act, which gave all Native Americans um, that were born in the United States instant citizenship. So at the time, they were not considered citizens of the United States. And really, um, what kind of encouraged this to happen was the fact that so many Native Americans served in World War One and showed that they were loyal to the country and honorable. And so this kind of pushed this this act into happening. And Coolidge wanted them to be treated equally. In 1926, he passes the Air Commerce Act. Okay, so now we have more planes going back and forth, and this was it approved the first two airline routes, and it helped this new industry. Here's my little joke: take off. Ha ha ha. There's my Coolidge joke. Um, it helped this industry kind of get started. It put it under government control, and government could kind of give them finances and put limits on cost so that this was actually able to be a business that was starting to um, be productive. So, and that's airplanes and flying back and forth. So that's the Air Commerce Act. Then in 1928, several countries got together, and these names come from the two representatives from France and the United States, Kellogg-Briand Pact, and these two guys were kind of in charge, and they got several countries, and eventually it was almost all major countries except about, I think maybe 4 or 5, and they agreed not to use war as a tool for national policy. So I agree that I'm not going to just automatically assume that I can go to war with someone. Now remember that's what Wilson was afraid of. Once we go to war, we'll always be at war. So these guys must have been afraid of that too. And so they got the countries together to agree that we're not just going to use war as a method of solving our problems. The problem with this is it was unrealistic. There was no way to enforce it. How am I going to make sure that you follow what we say? It was just kind of very idealistic. Like, yes, I promise to be good. It's the same way like when you get in trouble with your parents and your parents say, are you ever going to do that again? No, I promise I won't ever do that again. That's not usually very realistic either, is it? So and there was no punishment for breaking the pact. So it was really unrealistic. And it was not successful. It didn't work. It didn't keep Hitler from rising to power in Germany. It didn't keep us from going to war later. It was a good effort on these people's part, but it wasn't specific enough to really help. Okay, so things are being done to try to help international relations, but it's not really going that well. Coolidge as a president was more focused on the United States and on the economy of the United States doing well than international policy. And I wanted to tell you this, I thought this was cool. Coolidge was something I read said that it compared him to like Cleveland. So remember, Cleveland felt that his job was to protect the United States and to veto. So Coolidge was a little like Cleveland in it. He felt like his job was not this real big interactive president like Theodore Roosevelt, but his job was to let America run and to do his best to make sure that it ran well. Do you see the difference? Instead of, I'm going to make this change and do this and make this change, he was, look, the states need to run their business. The governors can run their states, and I trust them, and they're going to do a good job. And I just need to make sure that everything behind the scenes is taken care of so they can do their job well. Okay? one of his heroes as far as presidency goes was Harrison. And Benjamin Harrison was like that also. So we have him as kind of not, what did we call, progressive presidents that are changing this and changing this and changing this. But we have someone who is wanting to just make sure that he can do what he can to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And during his term, it did. Now, meanwhile, what's going on? Okay, we've got the 20s. We already know about the Charleston. We know the dances. We know about the flappers and the short hair, and we know about the speakeasies and people going and still being able to get alcohol. We've talked a little bit about the gangster idea. We know that that's going on. But what else is going on? So, 1925, we have a famous trial called the Scopes Monkey Trial. And Scopes was the last name of a teacher in Tennessee who was taken to court for teaching evolution. There was a law in Tennessee that you could not teach evolution, and there was a lot of fear at that time around the teaching of evolution. And they took him to court and had this big, long court trial. And a lot of people believe it was basically just to bring a lot of attention to the issue. And in the end, he was convicted and fined $100. But one thing that I think the effect of this trial is it started to put questions in people's minds about creation, and it made headlines. It made everyone start to think about it. That maybe we should change our thinking. In 1925, we also have Birdseye create frozen food. Well, if you go to the grocery store, well, probably not allowed, but if you go to the grocery store now and look in the frozen food section, you will still see Birdseye vegetables. And the idea of frozen food is new. So people get a little bit more convenience food now. Not everything has to be from the garden. And they can stick it in the freezer and have it easier and quicker. In 1926, this is the picture up here in the corner, Gertrude Ederle, I think is how you say her last name, was the first woman to swim the English Channel. She was an Olympic swimmer, and she was the first woman to do this. I thought she was born in New York, and I thought she would be someone interesting to look up and learn more about. Nehemiah, you might be interested in learning more about her if you haven't heard about her yet. I would Google a little bit and see what you can find out. 1927, Charles Lindbergh. That's a name you should know. He's the one that flew the Spirit of St. Louis. First solo transatlantic flight, he went from New York to Paris. And instantly, he became bigger than any of the movie stars. He was an instant hero everywhere he went. He even visited, one of the highlights of Coolidge's term was when Charles Lindbergh came to the White House and met with them. And Grace was at that meeting also. So this is, Charles Lindbergh becomes a hero. Everyone wanted to know about Charles Lindbergh and what was going on. In 1927 also we have the Great Mississippi Flood, which was the most destructive river flood in U.S. history. Many levees broke, and there was a lot of problems around this because many people felt like the African American community in that areas were not treated as well as the white people. That the white people were rescued first. That many of the black people were made to work in bad conditions. That they were kept in these kind of like camps after everything flooded, and they didn't have a lot of what they needed. And there was a lot of problems around this catastrophe. But during this, we see Herbert Hoover again showing his ability to help out in a crisis. and his just his humanitarian spirit, which is helping people out that are having problems. Then, okay, I'm showing you some of these things because I want you to see how times are changing. So we have frozen vegetable. Now we have sliced bread, Wonder Bread. So bread that can stay on the shelf for a while, that you can go to the store and get in a bag and it's already cut up. So that is brand new in 1927. And then you have in 1928, Walt Disney creates Mickey Mouse. And he appears in his first short film, Steamboat Willie. You can look this up on YouTube and see a little clip of Steamboat Willie. But a lot of times at the beginning of some of the Disney movies, you see this little image, don't you? And that is Steamboat Willie. Okay, how he was first presented. During this time, we have what became known as later the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem is a town in New York that it was was a large African American community, and this was a time that African Americans were becoming well known for sharing their experiences through art, writing, and music. So you have a lot of people coming out at this time who are becoming famous for their poems and their writing and their singing, and they are finally telling their story. They are sharing how they feel, the perspective from their eyes, and they're becoming recognized. Jazz music is in this idea, and they are many of them becoming very successful, and also making sure that African Americans have a voice. And this is kind of a new thing. Kind of right along with that, we have the Great Migration, which is what it became known as, of a lot of the African Americans that were from the South. So you could still have people during this time that were born slaves or whose parents were slaves. And many of them still live in the South, and they began moving from the South to the bigger cities in the North, like Detroit, like New York, to find jobs, to live in cities among other communities. And so you have those city populations growing as more and more people are moving up, mostly African Americans. So think back at the flood. That Mississippi flood caused some of the Great Migration. As their homes were flooded and as they didn't have anything, many of them moved up north to try to rebuild their homes. Radio shows become a big deal in like 1 year between 1923 and 1924. I think in the first year there was like 50 radio shows. In the next year, it jumped to like 500. There was having a radio in every home was pretty much a thing by the end of the 20s. Almost everyone had a radio, and they had you would gather around. You know how people come and watch the television? Well, they would gather around the radio after dinner or a certain time in the day and listen to these shows that were being programmed over the radio, comedy shows, ball games that were being announced, news programs, all kinds of different things. And Coolidge became kind of the first radio president. He would speak over the radio, and we already heard that Grace loves the radio and listens to it often. So radios are showing up in homes. Wonder Bread showing up in homes. Frozen food, which means freezers, also are showing up in homes. So we're starting to change a little bit. People are more and more people are buying cars. Cars will become more common in this for just the regular person to own a car will become more common in this decade. There's a lot of things going on, and America is looking great, looking really good. And then Calvin Coolidge gets out of office, and we know that we're getting ready to get into the Great Depression. So I love how we can see history and look at these waves of time as we look back, and we are comforted in some ways, it's encouraging to look back and say our lives are going to be the same way. There's going to be bad, there's going to be good, there's going to be, you may have this, you may have a big flood, but hey, you might get Wonder Bread. So there's just kind of ups and downs and ups and downs. That's what life is. And as we look at history, that's proven over and over and over and over again. Okay. Let me know in your comments something that either you have found out that I have not mentioned in your research and you're looking on interesting things that happened in the 1920s. Tell me something that you have found. Tell me something that maybe you want to Google a little bit more about Wonder Bread. Maybe you want to Google a little bit more about Steamboat Willie and see what the second character was that came out. Maybe you want to know what are some of the names of the radio shows. Maybe you want to look up one of the artists. Langston Hughes was one of the writers from the Harlem Renaissance. Maybe you want to know some names from that. Maybe you want to look up a little bit more about Gertrude. Maybe you want to know more about the monkey trial or Charles Lindbergh. Tell me a question, something that you would want to Google, okay? That you want to know a little bit more about. And it doesn't have to be from these two slides. It could be from the legislation slides also. But tell me something that piques your interest and a question or something that you would Google.